It's a great pleasure to have you here with this evening. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Samarine. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. And what I'm going to do is give a presentation that's very visual. I'll be giving a sort of running commentary on my images that I will show as I share my screen, and take you through what I discovered in the researches for this book, some of which I already knew about, but some of which was very eye-opening for me as well. I never expected to find as much as I actually did. Here we are looking now at the front cover of the book, and I'd like to explain to you, first of all, about the title, because the title has been quite controversial one way or another, because people have made the mistake of taking it literally, when in fact, as it explains in the introduction, it is a deliberate double irony based on the derivation of the word Saracens. It's from the Arabic sadaqa, to steal, so sariqin are people who stole. That is what the Westerners, the Crusaders mainly, referred to Arab Muslims as looters. That was the language of the times, you know. And so my joke, if you like, is, you know, so here we are calling people we stole things from, we're calling them thieves. But of course, it's meant to be light-hearted. It's a double irony. And so that's why it's the subtitle, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, which is really what the book is about. And of course, it's about how you can't really steal things in that sense. Everything builds on everything else. And so that's really the purpose of the book, is to show that there's no such thing as stealing or looting from this or that. You know, everything is interwoven in ways that we really need to understand in order to see how globally and culturally interconnected we all are. And the choice of the cover itself is it shows the inside of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And the reason for that choice is that Christopher Wren, when he built St. Paul's, said that he had used Saracen vaulting in the dome. And he explains that, quite simply, it is the best. And he draws diagrams to explain why it's superior to the other kinds of vaulting which people were familiar with in Europe at the time. And when he says Saracen vaulting, I mean, this is just the language of the 17th century. You know, it's nothing. In those days, it was not necessarily seen as a disparaging term in the way that it's slightly become today. So one has to make allowances for the kind of language that people used in earlier centuries, because it was the only way they knew of referring to people. You know, this was just a reflection of his times. So I'll explain now why I wrote the book. And I was never planning to write a book about architecture. It's something that I've always been interested in all my life, but I didn't understand just how much I was interested until the fire at Notre Dame, basically. When that cathedral in the center of Paris caught fire in April 2019, the whole world was transfixed by this, and it was a huge outcry in France especially, but worldwide. But in France, they were saying, our national identity is going up in flames. And you know, given that France has this great tradition of laïcité, as they call it, secularity, it struck me as very ironic that suddenly they were having this huge tie to this building, this religious building, as if it was part of their soul going up in flames, and all the sort of appropriation that was going on, as if this was their creation, part of France and nothing else. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, don't you realize that most of these architectural elements that form Gothic architecture, most of these came from the Middle East, from further east. And so I thought, well, clearly people either don't know this or have forgotten it or are deliberately overlooking it. So maybe I need to write something to kind of set the record straight, really, to remind people how many of these things that they are now thinking of as entirely French in a kind of nationalistic way are in fact have their origins much further east, and to the beginnings of our story. And here in this picture, we have what is known today in Syria as the dead cities, or the cities of the dead, or the forgotten cities. There are many names for them, and they were belatedly recognized in 2011, just after the Syrian civil war broke out, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, for the reason that concentrated here in the limestone hills to the north and west of Aleppo, you have the most extraordinary concentration of early Christian architecture. You have, from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, you have this extraordinary collection spread across about 800 settlements of over 2,000 churches, which show the earliest church architecture, the earliest Christian architecture. It's the transition from pagan architecture, from Roman pagan architecture, to early Christian architecture. And that's what makes these cities so remarkable. And among the churches there are two particularly famous ones. The one on the left is called Kalb Lawze, which is very high in the hills and is actually the very first time that you have the style that came to be known as Romanesque of the twin towers flanking a monumental entrance. And the design for this, so in other words, it's just like Notre Dame, the design for this was in order to welcome pilgrims into the monumental entrance, to make them feel they had arrived somewhere special. And Kalb Lawze is itself on the pilgrimage route to St. Simeon's Basilica, which is the picture on the right of the screen. St. Simeon Stylites, as he was known, the stylite is Greek for pillar. So he preached from the top of his pillar, and the picture here shows all that's left of his pillar because it was chipped away at by pilgrims over the centuries. And in its day, this was completed in 490. In its day, it was the Santiago de Compostela of its time. It was the most important Christian pilgrimage site. This is 50 years before Hagia Sophia was built in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. So the importance of this site in early architecture, in early Christian architecture, cannot be overstated. Tragically, in the Syrian civil war, the pillar here of St. Simeon was blown to smithereens by a Russian airstrike. Sadly, there has been damage to some of these sites, and it's inevitable, of course, that the blame game begins about whose fault it was, but this particular one was a Russian airstrike. Now, when you look closely at the architecture of these churches in the Syrian dead cities, you can see the quality of the craftsmanship, the stonemasons. I mean, stonemasonry as a craft is literally as old as the hills in this part of the world, because the limestone is there. That is their building material. So they have learnt extraordinary levels of skill in their carving. And you can see here on the top of the pillar, you have what's known as the swaying acanthus leaves. And in Notre Dame in Paris, one of the first aisles in the nave of the cathedral has exactly these swaying acanthus leaves on the top, showing that somebody, a Syrian stonemason, must have brought these skills in. And so that, the skills moved across, because with the movement of the pilgrims and the merchants backwards and forwards, all these ideas traveled with them. And in France, there are two villages called St. Simeon, which are named after the Syrian saint. And I visited one of them last summer. It's just east of Paris, and in it, it's extraordinary. It's like stepping into a little piece of Syria. And they have stained glass windows there with the picture of the saint on the left, standing on his pillar. And on the right, there's another image of St. Simeon at the top of his pillar, and that one happens to be in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice and is a mosaic. So that, if you like, is the sort of bedrock of Christian architecture, early Christian architecture that was already in the region before the first Muslim conquest, then when the Umayyads came in from the Arabian Peninsula and made Damascus their capital. The very first building that the Umayyads themselves created as a sort of political statement was the Dome of the Rock. And this dates from 690. Abdul Malik, the Caliph, commanded that it be built as a statement that Islam is a new religion, because again, scholarship has shown that when the Muslims first came into this part of the world, they were actually mistaken for another heretical sect of Christianity. It wasn't realized that this was an entirely new religion. And so that's why the Dome of the Rock is so important. The inscription that you can see running around the outside there is actually quoting to it's stating it's admonishing Christians for believing in three gods, the Trinity. God, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, and saying you must not believe in three gods, you must only believe in one God. And some scholars, early architectural historians, have looked at the Dome of the Rock and said, oh, well, that's just a Byzantine building. They've just copied everything from the Byzantines. But that is not true at all. It is true that the octagonal shape was already in existence in Christian martyria, that's saints' tombs, and with the dome, that itself is true. But this is very different because in Byzantine churches and shrines, all the decoration is inside. The outside is by and large very plain, whereas here, as you can see, there is massive, colorful decoration on the outside as a statement and completely altering the character of the Byzantine style. But not only that, there are two other very significant innovations in the Dome of the Rock, which become tremendously important then in the later development of Gothic architecture. And this cross-section of the Dome of the Rock shows you this very clearly. So if we go to the bottom arcade, you will notice that the arches towards the right-hand side are slightly pointed, because in the circular arcade that runs around the stone in the center of the Dome of the Rock, for the first time you see some pointed arches, which were developed then later by the Abbasids further. And the second innovation that you see is at the top, under the dome, that little arcade of tiny trefoil arches, as they're known. These are little sort of triple domes, little triple arches, and that is the very first time that they appear in a religious setting like this. And of course, Gothic architecture, as we know, is covered in pointed arches and trefoil arches, as you'll see in some later images. So the Umayyads did introduce, what they did was they came in and they blended the architecture from what was there before, and then they introduced some of their own innovations. And in Damascus, which was their capital, you can see this blending very clearly in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque in this picture. So when you look at it there, you've got the Byzantine dome, you've got the Hellenistic gable over on the left there, which is straight out of Greek temples. And then you've got the minaret, which is mimicking the square minaret like that, is mimicking the church towers. All the church towers in the churches across Syria were square. So when you look at that, you could think it was a bell tower or something. And yet the name for that locally is the Jesus Minaret, which is another example of how blended the local cultures were, because local tradition had it that on the final day of judgment, Christ would descend from this minaret. And very, very typical of this blending. And in cities like Damascus, to this day, all the mosques are open to non-Muslims. As a Christian, as any religion, you can go into the mosque, you can sit there, you know, you can spend the entire day there, and everybody, you know, it's completely open and welcoming to all. And local people in Damascus will go, you know, Muslims will go to churches with their friends, with their Christian friends at Easter and at Christmas, and at major celebrations in the Muslim calendar, Christians will come into the mosque. It's just completely normal, integrated style of behavior that you know, is not the sort of thing that's normally talked about. Alas, in the media, the focus always tends to be on the conflict rather than the many, many examples of people living side by side completely harmoniously. Now, here is a detail of within the Damascus Umayyad Mosque of the mosaic, which is all around the internal courtyard. And again, you can see in that how blended the early Umayyad architecture was. So this is the first Islamic art, if you like. And so you've got, interestingly, the triple window. So that is taken directly from the early churches, lots of triple, you know, representing the Trinity. So you have triple arches, you have the nave with the two side aisles making three. You know, the number three occurs everywhere in the architecture of early churches. And then you've got the columns and capitals separating those windows, which are taken from the Hellenistic sites that are all over Syria, sites like Palmyra and Apamea. And then the actual iconography of what it's showing, though, is then completely different to what you would see in any kind of Byzantine or Roman mosaic, because it's basically visions of paradise. The gold and green mosaics there are showing trees and gardens and fantasized buildings. It is images of fertility and paradise. And on the left-hand side there, that little inset is a similar inside mosaic, again showing the detail of the trefoil arch from the Dome of the Rock, just so that you can see the two Umayyad styles, you know, how it's all so blended. And the Umayyads also used these same architectural styles in their secular architecture. So this is the entrance to the Damascus National Museum. And what they've done to create the entrance is they have used the facade, the monumental entrance between the two towers. Here the towers have become rounded, from one of the Umayyad desert palaces, which is where the caliphs used to go to escape city life, if you like, to sort of relive their Bedouin roots. And this one is called Qasr al-Hayr al-Gharbi. It's in a very ruined state, but in the 1930s, French excavators went and brought fragments that they could find and integrated them here into the entrance of the Damascus National Museum. And when you see the detail of the carving on these Umayyad structures, on these palaces, you can recognize the quality of the stonemanship from the churches that we saw earlier with a swaying acanthus. So this detail here is a very typical early Umayyad carving in limestone. And this one is from the Mushatta Palace. You can actually see this up close because the entire facade was given by the Ottoman Sultan to the Kaiser, and that which is why it's now on display in Berlin in the Islamic history of Islamic art museum within the Pergamon Museum. So you can get really up close to this and examine the sheer quality and the fecundity of the carving, the way it's almost bursting with nature and life and animals intertwined as well. and flowers everywhere. You can actually recognize the flowers and the vines, and all the plants are local to the environment and can be identified. And the other innovation from the Umayyad times were these geometric window grills. So to the left there, this is from the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, one of the marble geometric windows patterns, very, very beautiful. And those then were adopted, and you find them particularly in places like Venice. So on the right-hand side there, there's a row of 4 of them in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And then the final innovation from the Umayyad times is what is thought to be the earliest rose window. So on the left there, this is a reconstruction of what excavators found. And this window was within an Umayyad palace called Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is very close to Jericho in what is today the occupied West Bank. And the position of the window, the excavators were able to work out, was high up in the gable of the main audience hall of the palace. And it had fragments of stained glass in it, colored glass. So clearly its function was to let in decorative light. So very, very early idea of a round decorative window to let in colored light, which of course, after many, many centuries, reaches its culmination in something like the stained glass there, the 12th and 13th century stained glass of Chartres Cathedral in France, which is the absolute apogee of rose windows in Gothic cathedrals. Now, the stained glass itself is another whole story, which I was not expecting to find links with the stained glass itself back to Syria. But what I discovered was that the earliest glass used in Gothic cathedrals, so that's in the 12th century, 12th century glass has been analyzed now scientifically and been proved to have what's known as the Islamic composition, which means that it's the raw materials for this glass were all shipped out from Syria by the Crusaders after the Crusades, when they set up their kingdoms in places like Antioch. And the glass, they saw the quality of the glass making, because Syria had long been the center of glass making. Very, very high quality glass, and the raw materials were perfect for that. So Raqqa, for example, that we now only associate with ISIS, Raqqa was known in Abbasid times as produced the best glass in the world at that time. And they used the pebbles of the Euphrates, and they mixed it with a local salty plant known as ushnan, and that made the perfect flux, so that when you put it in the very hot furnace, the quality of glass that was produced made, and then when you colored it, and again, the knowledge of how to make these colors, the alchemy of it all, was also developed in Syria. And what you found then, so these very early colors, the very deep blue, the very deep red there, these unique, incredibly strong colors with a thick glass full of slight impurities with bubbles, creates this very mysterious light as the sun comes through them. And the quality of the glass there was recognized very early on, so that when the glass industry in Syria was destroyed by Tamerlane and his Mongols in 1401, and that paid to the glass industry in Syria, because Tamerlane ran off with all the craftsmen and took them back to Samarkand. So, but that knowledge, the Venetians then became the prime glass makers, and took the knowledge that they had observed, and took some of the craftsmen must have made their way back to Venice as well, because the Venetian recipes in the 1500s and in the 1400s, so in the 15th century after the Tamerlane destruction, actually specify that they want the cinders of Syria. So this is the special Bushnan plant, which gives the glass its very special quality, far superior to anything that Europe could make at that time. So it, for me, I find that very moving to think that so much of the glass, the most beautiful glass in our earliest cathedrals, and it's been shown to exist in Canterbury Cathedral, in York Minster, in Notre Dame, as I mentioned, in Chartres, and in Saint-Denis, and in Rouen. All of these places have the Islamic composition as it's known. So when the Umayyad dynasty was put to an end by the Abbasids, so this was 750 we're in now, they basically killed all of the Umayyad ruling family except for one. The Umayyad prince Abdurrahman managed to escape and make his way across all of North Africa and to enter Spain, where he set up, if you like, Syria in Spain. I mean, as an exile, of course, like all exiles and refugees, what they set out to do is to recreate their homeland in their new place. And so Abdurrahman put out a call across the Mediterranean to say that any other Umayyad people who were still loyal to the Umayyads should come to a new dynasty that he was setting up in Cordoba, his capital, and so within a remarkably short space of time, he had established a new dynasty which gradually took over the whole of the Iberian Peninsula and was known as Andalusia, of course. And the picture here is an aerial view of the Cordoba Mesquita, which is itself modeled on the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, because Abdurrahman set out to recreate with what he knew. He wanted to recreate Damascus in Cordoba. And so you have a lot of the same patterns. Now it's been added to over the centuries. So at first glance, it doesn't look so similar. But what you do have, you have the square minaret that was built, and of course now has been converted into the church bell tower. So here we have an example of something going back from something that was built as a Muslim structure being used as a Christian structure now, the toings and froings of empires. And inside the Cordoba Mesquita, you have for the first time now, and this is now, this is in the 10th century extension of the Cordoba Mesquita built by Abdurrahman's successors, you have the extraordinary vaulting techniques which start to be used in Islamic architecture, which have never been seen before in Europe, and are based on a lot of the mathematical knowledge that was coming out from the Abbasid courts, because although the Abbasids were in theory enemies of the Umayyads, there was still a lot of cultural exchange between scholars and merchants, toing and froings. It wasn't that there was, that the East and Western Muslim empires, yes, they were rivals on one level, but politically, but not in terms of cultural exchange and commercial exchange. And so a lot of scholars moved between the two courts. And so here we have in front of the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita, the astonishing degree of vaulting using geometry to a very, very high standard. And this dome was examined by architectural engineers. I think it was 2016 or 17. So very, very recently, for the first time, they got permission to go in and do a proper study of it. And they were astonished at what they found, because they discovered that it was one of the most perfect examples of a geometrical dome that they had ever seen. And it has never needed structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And on the back wall of the Cordoba Mesquita, you have the masons' marks. So these are the names of the stonemasons who built it. And when you look at these names, they are overwhelmingly Muslim names written in Arabic script. There's a few that are not, but overwhelmingly about sort of 90% of them are clearly Muslim names. And these masons' marks were found during a renovation where they had to go down into the foundations. And so obviously they weren't on display like this at the time. All of these masons were anonymous at the time, but it's interesting that then in an accidental discovery, they found all of these marks, and they are now on display on the back wall of the Cordoba Mesquita. And here is a close-up of the mihrab within the mesquita. And again, you can see the trefoil arches there running across the top. So Abdurrahman, was familiar with trefoil arches. They occurred in the Dome of the Rock, as I said. They then also occurred in the desert palaces that the Umayyads built. It was used really quite a lot, by and large, as quite a small decorative arch. And so you again see it here in pride of place above the mihrab. And of course, they've developed the horseshoe arch by this point as well. And I mean, Cordoba Mesquita is an extraordinary example of arches everywhere. So the double arch, it's like a forest inside, with so many arches. People have said that the double arches are like palm trees opening up. When you walk through, they're kind of, they're meant to symbolize the sort of opening up of palm leaves. And when you look at the outside gates of the Cordoba Mesquita, you have every conceivable arch that you could imagine. You've got horseshoe arches, you've got trefoil arches, you've got interconnecting arches, you've got here interconnecting arches and ogee arches. And over on the left there, just for comparison, that is a picture that is of the Galilee Chapel, as it's known, in Durham Cathedral. So you can see again how they have copied the interlocking arches much later, because don't forget the Cordoba Mesquita here is 10th century, so it's well before anything like Durham was built. I mean, these arches were not seen further north. They're only known in Spain. Spain was, where these techniques first came to the European mainland. And this is still now within the Cordoba Mesquita. You have, so from the trefoil arch, it develops into the cinquefoil arch. So that's with 5 little lobes. And then you have the multifoil arch. I mean, all looks very strange here because they, of course, since it was converted into a cathedral after the Reconquista by Ferdinand and Isabella, they put crucifixes in the arches and turned. It's now surrounded by 42 chapels all around the outside. So it's a very strange feeling as you go into a building like that. And here you also have multifoil arches and the very decorated stucco work, which you think of as Umayyad or Andalusian, but actually this is in the Cordoba synagogue. And it's interesting that the Jews in Andalusia chose to adopt Islamic architecture as their preferred style. And when they were kicked out in the Reconquista by Ferdinand and Isabella, they actually took that style with them and used it as sort of when they built new synagogues. So, for example, in Berlin, the new synagogue in Berlin very much uses the same Islamic or sort of Moorish styles, as they tend to be known. And then the absolute culmination in Andalusia is the palace that the late Umayyads built. So this was just before they fell, the final stages of the Reconquista, because they lost Spain bit by bit. And this is the final stages now in the late 10th century. This is a palace called Medinat az-Zahra, which is on the outskirts of Cordoba, where it is the most incredibly elaborate palace, unlike anything that had ever been seen on European soil before. And yet this place was visited by bishops and European diplomats, Christian diplomats from the courts further north. And so they all came and saw all of these styles and were completely bowled over. The contemporary accounts of what they saw are very vivid. They were very in awe of the standards of luxury that existed at that point in Andalusia. So that's Spain, if you like, which was the main way that these styles, these Islamic styles, entered the European mainland. But there were other routes in as well. So here on the left, we have Amalfi Cathedral, and Amalfi on the Italian coast. Before the rise of Venice, the Amalfi merchants were the main people trading with the Eastern Mediterranean. And they were trading with cities like Cairo, and the merchants there saw the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo with its pointed arches and were very taken with it and thought that, you know, they liked the style very much. And so when they had a rebuilding of their cathedral, they imported the workmen and the materials and built their cathedral in that style using pointed arches for the first time. And then the abbot of the Benedictines, who were the most powerful monks in Europe at the time, the abbot of Monte Cassino, paid a visit to Amalfi to buy some rich silks that they'd been trading from the Eastern Mediterranean cities. And he was very taken with the pointed arches as well, and said, I would like to use that in my rebuilding project in Monte Cassino. So he likewise imported the same workmen and the same materials, because of course the local people wouldn't have known how to make this. And so if you've got a lot of money, like the Benedictines did, they want the best. You know, they can pay for the best. So they want a good job. They're not going to get a local builder to do a kind of botched job. They get in the real professionals, the real experts. So they import them from Egypt in this particular case. And so this is how the styles then gradually start to enter into the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, which is controlled by the Benedictines. And the Benedictines, their headquarters is at Cluny, and the abbot at Cluny also paid a visit to Monte Cassino, saw the pointed arches there, and decided to use them as well in his rebuilding project. And of course, once Cluny, the headquarters of the very, very powerful Benedictines, had it, then of course everybody wanted it. Every bishop in every city across Europe wanted to have the new style, the pointed arches. And so that's how, you know, the rivalry began, if you like, between bishops, between different cities, in order to have the best, the latest, the biggest, the tallest Gothic cathedral, because they also discovered that the pointed arch was structurally stronger than the round arch. And so it meant that windows could become taller, the walls could become thinner. And of course, this is how we developed the whole stained glass window idea of decorated windows, and the whole style evolves from that basis. So the photo here is of the cathedral in central France at Le Puy, where you can see the Syrian styles being imported, you know, via Andalusia. So you have this style called ablak, of the patterned, alternating pattern of black and white. You find that in Syria a lot, and in the Abdurrahman with his dynasty at Cordoba, he had it in red and white because that was the colors of his dynasty. And so you find it then being used here in a cloister, in a cathedral in Le Puy, which is one of the pilgrimage stops on the way to Santiago de Compostela. So the Benedictines here are building shrines on the way to Santiago de Compostela, all starting to use pointed arches. Cloisters, by the way, also found in Syria for the first time, the early Christian architecture, but all imported through here. And then they've even inscriptions, because another sort of interesting misunderstanding from the Middle Ages, that Arabic script was thought to be the language of Christ. And so because they saw it on the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Rock was mistaken for the Temple of Solomon by the early Crusaders. So they copied it. They just copied the script, not understanding what it was, thinking it was holy script. And so some of these cathedrals and churches on the way to the Santiago de Compostela have got Arabic script incorporated because they thought it was sacred. Now, another way that influences came in is via Sicily, because again, with the Crusaders, you have the King Roger of Sicily. You know, when he set up a court there, he broke away as a sort of Norman court there as a Norman knight, and was so influenced by the styles that he again imported the laborers, and in the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, you have this another extraordinary blend of types of architecture. So you've got the Byzantine style mosaics there on the left, and you've got the pointed arches, and on the right hand side you've got the ceiling in this Muqarnas style, where again they brought in the wooden the carpenters from Cairo, because they were the only ones who had the skills to do this, to make incredibly elaborate woodwork ceilings that you can still see in Sicily today. So these, again, Christian Norman knights, of course, all from France originally, all these styles then found their way in. And of course, it was the Normans in 1066 who then conquered, England, Britain, and brought the styles in then into places like Canterbury to begin with. So it's very interesting that at this time now in Christian manuscripts, for example, you start to see for the first time images of God as the architect of the universe with a pair of compasses, geometry. Suddenly there's this understanding in Europe of geometry and the importance of geometry in making buildings. And that's an entirely new concept that was not in Christian, in any images until this point. This is a 13th century frontispiece from a French Bible. And then the other, not just religious, but also military borrowings came in via the Crusaders. So this here is the Chateau Gaillard, as it's known, overlooking the Seine, which is between Rouen and Paris, built by Richard the Lionheart, because after he returned from the Crusades, he was very influenced by the superior military architecture he had seen in the castles there, and he brought back all that knowledge and used it at Chateau Gaillard, which was his favorite castle and where he lived out his final days. You can see the scalloped shape of the keep there, which was deliberately rounded to deflect enemy fire, because round surfaces deflect it much more effectively than a flat square surface. This is a map of the very first pictorial map of Jerusalem, drawn by a pilgrim who visited in the 1500s, and he took an artist with him. Actually, he was a churchman. He was the dean of Mainz, and he took an artist with him to draw this first pictorial image of Jerusalem that had ever been seen by people in Europe who hadn't visited for themselves. And the remarkable thing about it is what is pride of place there, right in the center? The Dome of the Rock, a Muslim shrine, because, as I said before, this misperception of the Dome of the Rock as the Temple of Solomon, and then the Templar Knights adopted it as their symbol on their coins. They completely misunderstood that this was a Muslim shrine. And so it's very ironic and quite amusing that many churches, the round churches that we have, for instance, there's one in the city, the Round Temple Church, as it's known. There's one in Cambridge. There are several spread across Europe, are all modelled unknowingly on a Muslim shrine. But this was incredibly influential at the time. This image, this map, was reproduced because it was part of a book, of a story of his pilgrimage. The book was translated into every European language and was reprinted many, many times. And the error was only acknowledged much, much later, centuries later. So another example of how early knowledge, people just misunderstood and didn't have, it's not like they had the internet to check these things out. So they relied on what the priests and the elite told them, because obviously very few people could actually read and were literate at that time. So now we come to Venice, where we've got, this is St. Mark's Basilica, which is so clearly an Islamic building. I mean, the domes there are using the Islamic double dome system that Christopher Wren is using in St. Paul's. You've got this very decorated filigree architecture. You've got the mosaic styles and the window grills. I mean, the whole thing just looks Islamic. And when I was doing my researches, other scholars basically have done a huge amount of work on all of these fields, but they tended to concentrate on one field. So in the case of Venice, there is a lady called Deborah Howard, who was the professor of architectural history at Cambridge University, and she devoted 10 years of her life to researching this, and she wrote a book called Venice and the East, which details all the cultural exchanges. And so her book was my main source for my chapter on Venice. And very often, I found as I started to research that, earlier scholars had really very much produced detailed work on one particular field. So in the case of the heraldry, for example, there was a German scholar called Meyer who produced a book called Saracenic Heraldry, and he catalogued and detailed every single piece of heraldry from the Saracen world that he could find. I mean, it's an incredible piece of scholarship, very, very detailed. And there are many examples like that. And the book, incidentally, is fully footnoted, so you can see the source of all the information that I'm giving there. So still in Venice, again, you can see full of arches. I mean, the Venice isn't, openly Islamic city in its designs, in its styles. The arches, look at them. I mean, they're trefoil arches, pointed arches, ogee arches, and in the building there in the middle, which is the Palazzo Dario, you can see that circular design, which is known as the telephone dial motif from the old-fashioned telephone dial. That is copied directly off the fronts of palaces in Cairo, Mamluk palaces in Cairo that would have been contemporary with that in the 14th century. And on the right-hand side there, that is a detail of the Doge's palace. And the Doge's palace, again, as Deborah Howard catalogues in her wonderful Venice and the East, she details how the brickwork is copied from certain buildings, the filigree, the styles, the different ways of the space, the design of the courtyard, all these things. She tracks it from the original models in Cairo mainly, because the Venetians were trading with Cairo more strongly than with anywhere else, Cairo and Alexandria. And the Doge's palace produced, it was a very influential building in its own right, and many later European buildings then copied it. If you like, you could call the Doge's palace a sort of cathedral of commerce, because of course Venice was all about trade and commerce. And here is a picture of a carpet factory in Glasgow, the Templeton Carpet Factory, which is modelled on the Doge's palace, just to show how the styles were imported wholesale in the sort of 19th century revival, the whole sort of Gothic revival that was going on in this country. And so here now we're just looking at how these things have moved into the 19th century. So on the left-hand side there, you have the Cathedral of Burgos in northern Spain. That is from the 14th century. So it's sort of mid to late Gothic with this very delicate filigree. I mean, the way Wren describes, he actually says what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. He identifies it, and the way he defines it is very interesting. He says, from the lightness of its work, the excessive boldness of its elevations, delicacy, profusion, and extravagant fancy of its ornaments, it could only be attributed to the Moors, or what is the same thing, to the Arabians and Saracens. So that was how he saw it at the time. And now when you look at the 20th and 21st century example of Gothic, neo-Gothic, the Gothic revival, the building that mimics it most, and it's wonderful that it is actually still in Spain, is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona by the extraordinary architect Antoni Gaudí. And when you look at that, you can just see how it is, he's just turning it into an organic structure, mimicking nature, going all the way back to this incredible profusion. But this is a detail of the Sagrada Familia, and you can just immediately recognize the way the surfaces there are, sort of the facades are bursting with nature, with vegetation. And of course here, because it's a Christian building, there are some people mixed in the way that in the Islamic ones there are animals mixed in. But it's exactly the same principle. It's all designed to sort of show the profusion of God's creation, and it's this energy that has come in to the building. And Gaudí himself, you could call this style the Hispano-Saracenic Gothic, and he himself said, "I am a geometrician." That is to say, I synthesize. And he has this incredibly precise use of geometry in his buildings, which is why it's taken him so long. So he died before the building was completed. He'd been working on it for 43 years, but it's actually still not complete. It is designed, it is scheduled for completion in 2026, which will be the centenary of Gaudí's death. So it's taken 100 years to be able to complete it, because he's using a multicultural, multinational team of people to create it. Basically, the best he can find from every field. And so this sort of Gothic revival, the neo-Gothic style that took hold again in the 19th century in Europe, you can see it everywhere, basically, especially in London. So in London, you've got it in the Houses of Parliament. You've got the detail there of the Houses of Parliament on the right with the trefoil arches, the pointed arches. On the left, you've got Big Ben. Look at it, the way it's going up in registers and becoming more and more detailed and more delicate as it goes to the top. A very similar style to the early Umayyad minarets. And then in Paris, you've got Montmartre, which is actually built on the site of the martyr Denis, coming back to Denis as we were at the beginning. And on the website of Montmartre, it actually says that this Islamic architecture was used in the domes, the double dome system, and in the mosaics, Islamic influences have been used. And then, of course, it spreads across the Atlantic. So into America, here we're looking at the National Cathedral, and this is in Washington. Joe Biden went to pray there before his inauguration, and when you look at it, there you are. You've got twin towers flanking a monumental entrance. You've got pointed arches, ogee arches, rose window. You've got all those elements of the Gothic architecture, and it's in America. And in America still, there's no country in the world which has used Gothic more in its colleges and universities. So here on the left, you've got the Harkness Tower at Yale University, and on the right is Yale's lending library, which looks like a Gothic cathedral nave. I mean, they absolutely love it there because it sort of symbolizes the ancient culture of Europe as they saw it. Again, not realizing that in fact it all originated further east. And here, finally, this is the last slide now. This is the US Capitol Dome in Washington. And you can see from the cross section there how it uses the Islamic double dome system, the same as St. Paul's Cathedral. And it's, again, I think it's a rather wonderful irony that the center of American democracy and their parliament also has the Islamic system within its main dome there. So this is just to end on, actually, that the thing that I actually feel proudest of about the book was the endorsement that Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, gave to it. I mean, he read it cover to cover because he's interested in such things and is a very open-minded man, and he completely got it. When he sent back to the publishers this quote, I realized that he completely understood what this book is about. And as he says there, it's all about how our cultures, including our religious cultures, interact and interweave in ways that challenge all kinds of assumptions we might make about our history. And it's all about, you know, the future and how we have to acknowledge each other's contributions to things, and we have to acknowledge how everything builds on everything else.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana. That was a very insightful presentation.
Thank you, Diana, once more. Thank you to you all, and have a safe rest of the day. Thank you and take care.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.